The 13th Sunday after Trinity. Almighty and most merciful God, of whose only gift it cometh, that thy faithful people do unto thee true and laudable service. Grant, we beseech thee, that we may so faithfully serve thee, that we may finally, until we finally enter into thy promises through the merits of Jesus Christ. Amen. Verse 2 of Lent 143. Alone and fasting, Moses saw the following God who gave the law. To Elijah fasting came the steeds and chariots of flame. Well, we turn to Sir Fredric George Kenyon, assistant keeper of the manuscripts in the British Museum, and he's written a book on our Bible and the ancient manuscripts. So let's see what we can published in 1898, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Sydney, and New York. Air and Spottiswoode. Preface to the third edition. Okay. Additions and corrections. A lot of course, he's dealing with ancient manuscripts, so a lot of them. Wow. $309 pages. The Bible has a twofold history, internal and external. The internal history deals with the character of the narrative, and its teaching is a revelation of God and of God's will. The external history tells how and when the several books were written and how they've been preserved to us. The former treats of the Bible in its divine, the latter in its human aspect. The former is unique, differing not merely in detail, but in kind from the history of any other book. The latter is shared by the Bible with every other book that has been written. It is, of course, its internal value, which is of supreme value. But the very greatness of this value gives to the external history of the Bible a special interest and importance above that of all other books. The Bible claims to be unparalleled in preeminence. It is of the first consequence for us to know when and how it was written, whether the several books of it are authentic or whether they have been faithfully handed down to us through the centuries. The present volume deals solely with the latter part of the Bible's external history, the transmission of the sacred text. It is a subject upon which very much has been written, and each section of it has engaged the attention and occupied the lives of many scholars. My object has been to condense within limits of a moderate volume the principal results at which specialists have arrived, so as to furnish the reader, who is not himself a specialist in textual criticism, with a concise history of the Bible text, and to enable him to form an intelligent opinion on the textual questions which continually present themselves to the Bible student. In this attempt, I have necessarily been indebted to the labors of others at every turn. To acknowledge this indebtedness in every case, to trace every statement to its original owner, would be an endless task. To distract Davidson, Driver, Cornell, Buell on the Old Testament generally, to Field, Lagarde, Seriani, and Sweet on the Septuagint, to Scrivener, Gort, Gregory, and Hort on the New Testament, to writers in the second volume of Scrivener's Introduction. I hope also that I may have gained something from an acquaintance with the biblical manuscripts in the British Museum. This volume is especially intended for those who study the Bible in English, and in referring to details of textual criticism, I consequently had in mind the only edition of the English Bible, namely the Variorum, published by Air and Spottiswoode. With regard to the plates, facsimiles, large manuscripts, in a book which covers so much ground on which so much labor has been bestowed, it's useful to hope that there should be no room for differences of opinion or errors of detail. Department of Manuscripts, British Museum, 25 October 1895. Contents, the variations in the Bible text. 2. Authorities for the Bible text. 3. Original manuscripts of the Bible. It's got El Amarna tablets, writing in Babylonia, Egypt, Palestine. 4. The Hebrew text. 5. The ancient versions of the Old Testament. 6. The text of the New Testament. That'd be interesting. 7. The manuscripts of the New Testament. 8. Ancient versions of the New Testament. 9. The Vulgate in the Middle Centuries. 10. English manuscript Bibles. The Psalter of Aldhelm, Bede, Alfred, interlinear glosses in Latin Bibles. The Gospels of the 10th century. Elfric's Old Testament. Progress suspended by the Norman Conquest. Verse translations in 13. Wycliffe, earlier Wycliffe Bible, later Wycliffe Bible. Examination, English printed Bible. Okay, we'll go through. List of plates. Okay, he's got a lot of really good stuff here. Wow. Whoa, Alcuin's Vulgate, British Museum. English Gospels of the 10th century, British Museum. Wycliffe's Bible, Bodleian. Tyndale's New Testament. Our Bible in the Ancient Manuscript, Chapter 1, Variations in the Bible. The following history of the Bible text and of its translation into English. See if I can go one more bigger. Yeah, we can. Has been handed down to us from time when they were first written in the Hebrew or Greek. In our English Revised Version today, no one can read that version intelligently without seeing that in very many places there's considerable doubt as to the exact words used by the original writers. On nearly every page, especially the New Testament, we see notes in the margin to the effect that some authorities read this, or many authorities, ancient authorities, read that these readings, being alternatives to the readings actually adopted in the text of the revisers. The question inevitably follows, what are these ancient authorities? How comes it that they differ so frequently among themselves? How do we, or how does anyone know which to follow among these divergent witnesses? And then the larger question suggests itself, how has the text of the Bible come down to us? We know that several books which compose it were written many centuries ago and in another language than ours. What do we know of their history since that time, and how they've been preserved to us and translated into our own language? The difficulties suggested by the various readings in the Revised Version are made more prominent if we look at such an edition as the Variorum Bible. Here we find the several ancient authorities quoted separately whenever there's an important conflict of evidence as to the exact reading of any passage. Thus at Matthew 19:17, the words, "Why callest thou me God?" There's the following note. So see, and then it gives a list of the various manuscripts with their nomenclature, which I'm not going to read through because it's its own language. You have to have a scorecard. You used to have a scorecard around here. Why asks me concerning the good? The meaning of this note is that there are two divergent readings recorded in the passage, manuscripts known as C and Delta, which will be found in chapter 8. Two ancient translations of the New Testament into Syriac and Egyptian. The editor, McClellan, in the margin of the Revised Version read, "Why callest thou me good?" On the other hand, the four manuscripts, the editors, Elford, Lockman, Tischendorf, Tregals, West, Westcott, and Hart, is, "Why askest thou me concerning the good?" To the student acquainted with these critical symbols, this information is intelligible and important. But unless we have some previous knowledge of the subject, we shall not understand the comparative value of the various authorities. This indispensable information is given in the preface and introduction to the Ver Oriam Bible. But although stated with admirable conciseness and completeness, we've got a footnote. This is, I believe, the only critical edition of the Bible in English. It gives a digest under the head of various renderings. The names of the editors, Prof. Driver and Prof. Shane of the Old Testament, Prof. Sanday and Reverend Clark of the New, Reverend Ball of the Apocrypha, are guarantees for the excellent work. The surest results of biblical criticism are thus made accessible to English readers in a clear and compact form. Since the present book is intended primarily for those who study the Bible in English, references will be made to the notes of the Ver Oriam Bible rather than the critical editions of the Hebrew and Greek texts. It is all very well to say that such and such manuscripts support one reading of a passage, while the other manuscripts support another. But we are no better able than before to judge which reading is to be preferred, unless we know which manuscripts are likely to be right. The questions asked above recur with doubled force. How do there come to be differences in different records of the biblical text, and how do we know which reading we prefer when the authorities differ? But these questions are not idle nor unimportant, may be seen by mentioning a few of the passages in which important variations occur. We will, for the moment, take the Gospels alone. The doxology of the Lord's Prayer is omitted in the oldest copies of Matthew 6:13. Several copies omit Matthew 16, 2 and 3 altogether, along additional passages sometimes found in Matthew 20:28. The last 12 verses of St. Mark are omitted altogether by the two oldest copies of the original Greek. One very ancient authority inserts an additional incident after Luke 6:4, while it alters the count of the institution of the Lord's Supper in Luke 22:19 and 20, and altogether omits Peter's visit to the sepulchre in 24:12, and several other details of the resurrection. The version of the Lord's Prayer in Luke 11:2-4 is much abbreviated in many copies. The incident of the bloody sweat is omitted in 22:43-44, as also is the word from the cross, "Father, forgive them." The mention of a descent of an angel to cause the moving of the waters of Bethesda is entirely absent from the oldest copies, taken in adultery in 753-811. Besides the larger discrepancies such as these, there's scarcely a verse, this is a bit overstating, which there is not some variation of phrase in some copies. No one can say that these additions or omissions or alterations are matters of mere indifference. It is true, and it cannot be too emphatically stated, that none of the fundamental truths of Christianity rests on passages on which the genuineness is doubtful. But it still remains a matter of concern to us to know that our Bible, as we have it today, represents as closely as may be the actual words used by the writers of the sacred books. It is the object of this volume to present within a moderate compass and as clearly as possible the means we have for knowing that it does so. to trace the history of the sacred texts from the time of their original composition to our own revised version of 1885, to show the authorities on which they rest and the comparative value to be put upon each. It is the special duty of scholars to weigh the evidence on each particular disputed passage and to form editions and translations of the sacred books. But any intelligent reader without any knowledge of either Greek or Hebrew can learn enough to understand the process of criticism and the grounds on which the judgment of scholars must be based. Nor is the subject dry or uninteresting. The history of the Bible text has a living interest for all those who care for its contents, and no Englishman should be altogether ignorant of the history of the English Bible. Our preliminary question should be cleared away before proceeding to the history of the text. It is the question that naturally rises first. How do various readings of a passage come into existence? It is a question easily answered as soon as the character of the ancient books is understood. Nowadays, when an author writes a book, he sends it to the printer, from whom he receives proof sheets. He corrects the proof sheets until he is satisfied that it is printed accurately. Then hundreds or thousands of copies, as the case may be, are struck off from the same types and distributed to the world. Each of these copies is exactly like all the rest, and there can be no varieties of readings. All the extant copies of, say, any one edition of Macaulay's History or Tennyson's poems are identical. Tennyson may have himself altered his own verses from time to time, and so have other authors. But no one doubts that in each edition of a modern book we have, slips of editor and printer accepted, exactly what the author intended at the time, and that each copy of it is exactly like every other copy. But before the invention of printing, this was far from the case. Each separate copy of a book had to be written by hand, and the human hand and brain have not yet been created, which could copy the whole of a long work absolutely without error. Often, and this we may easily believe to have been especially the case in the early days of the Christian church, when it was poor, half-educated, and persecuted body, copies were made hurriedly and without the opportunity for minute revision. Mistakes were certain to creep in, and when once in existence, they were certain to increase, as fresh copies were made from manuscripts already faulty. If the original manuscripts of the sacred book were still preserved, the errors of the later copies would be to us now a matter of indifference. But since the original manuscripts perished long ago, we have to try to arrive at their contents by comparison of later copies, all of which are more or less faulty and all varying from one another. This is the problem of textual criticism, and it will be seen that its sphere is large. Printing was invented in 1554, little more than 4 centuries ago. But for all the centuries before that date, books existed only in handwritten copies, which we call manuscripts, from the Latin manu scriptum, written by hand, often abbreviated MS. Of the chief of these manuscripts we shall have to speak at greater length in the course of the book. Meanwhile, it will be clear that the existence of differences of reading in many passages of the Bible as we have it today is due to the mistakes in copying them hand by hand during the many centuries that elapsed between the composition of the books and the invention of writing. The mistakes of scribes are of many kinds and of varying importance. Sometimes the copyist confuses words of similar sound, as in English. We sometimes find our correspondence right there for there or here for here. Sometimes he passes over a word by accident, and this is especially likely to happen when 2 adjoining words end with the same letters. Sometimes this form of error operates more widely. Two successive lines of the manuscript from which he is copying end with the same or similar words, and the copyist's eye slips from the first to the second, and the intermediate line is omitted. Sometimes again, the manuscript from which he is copying has been furnished with short explanatory notes in the margin, and he fails to see where the text ends and the note begins, and so copies the note into the text itself. These are all simple errors of hand and eye. Errors of the mind are more dangerous because they are less easy to detect. The copyist's mind wanders a little from the book he is copying and writes down words which come mechanically into his head, just as we do nowadays if people talk while we are writing and distract our attention. Some words are familiar in certain phrases, and our familiar phrase runs off the pen of a copyist when the word should be written in some other combination. A form of this error is very common in manuscripts of the Gospels. The same event is often narrated in two or more than slightly different language, and the copyist, consciously or unconsciously, alters the words of one version to make them the same as the other. A careful reading of the Variorium Bible, or the Revised Version, will note many instances when this has happened. Thus, in Matthew 11:19, the Authorized Version has, "But wisdom is justified of her children," as in Luke 7:35. But the Revised Version tells us that the original text had works instead of children. Here the truth being that the copyists of all except the earliest extant manuscripts have altered it so as to make it correspond with the account of Luke. Similarly, in Matthew 16:13, our Lord's question in the RV, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, is?" and the margin tells us, "Many ancient authorities read that I, the Son of Man, am." The whole verse has probably been inserted from the parallel passages of Mark and Luke. In Luke 6:48, the words of the parable of the house built on the rock, because it had been well builded. Errors like these will increase in later copies as the words of the sacred narrative are more and more familiar to the copyists, and when once they do admit of correction, unless we are able to examine copies written before the corruption took place, they do not betray themselves by injuring the sense of the passage, as is generally the case with the errors of the first class. An untrue hand or eye or an over-true memory may do much harm in a copyist. The worst and most dangerous of all is that when the copyist begins to think for himself. The veneration in which the sacred books were held has generally protected them against intentional alterations of the text, but not entirely so. The harmonization of the gospel narratives described in the last paragraph has certainly been, in some cases, intentional, and that, no doubt, without the smallest wish to deceive, but simply with the idea of supplementing the one narrative from its equally authentic companion. Sometimes these alterations are more extensive. The earliest Greek translation of the Old Testament contains several passages in the book of Esther and Daniel which are not found in the Hebrew. The long passages, Mark 16:9-20, and John 7:53-8:11, which are absent from the oldest manuscripts of the New Testament, must have been omitted in these or inserted in the others intentionally. If, as is more probably, they have been inserted in the later copies, this was no doubt done in order to supplement the gospel from some other good source, and the narratives are almost certainly authentic, though they may not have been written by the evangelist in whose gospel they now appear. Indeed, in an Armenian translation of St. Mark has quite recently been discovered in which the last 12 verses of St. Mark are ascribed to Aristion, who is otherwise known as one of the earliest Christian fathers. It is quite possible that this tradition is correct, and that Aristion, maybe Aristides, compiled this short summary to take the place of the original ending, which has been lost. There is, however, no reason at all to suppose that editions of this kind have been made in any case except a few cases. The evidence for our Bible text is too great and of too varied a description to allow us to suppose that passages have been interpolated without any sign of being visible. The intentional alterations of the scribes are, for the most part, verbal, not substantial, such as the modification of a phrase in which one evangelist to suit the narrative of another, or the combination of two reports of some utterance into one, and errors of this kind can generally be detected on a comparison of the different manuscripts. From this short account of the different classes of mistakes into which copyists and manuscripts were most likely to fall, it will be clear that the later a manuscript is in date, or more likely it is to contain many errors. Each time a fresh copy is made, some new mistakes, and this is not necessarily true. Each time a fresh copy is made, some new mistakes will probably be introduced, while only the most obvious blunders in the manuscript copied will be corrected. It may therefore be stated as a general rule that the earlier a manuscript is, the better it is its text likely to be. The rule is only a general one and is liable to exceptions. For instance, a manuscript written in the year 1200, if copied direct from a manuscript of the year 350, will probably be more correct than a manuscript written in 1000, which was copied from one of 850 or 900. Each manuscript must therefore be searched to see if it shows signs of containing an early form of the text, but the general rule is that the earliest manuscripts are the best, will still usually hold good. The problem which lies before the textual critic, as the student of the language is technically called, is now becoming clear. The original manuscripts of the Bible written by the authors of the various books have long ago disappeared. The critic's object, consequently, is to reconstruct these texts. And here we'll have to call it verse 3 of Lent hymn 143. So Daniel trained his mystic sight, delivered from the lion's might, and John, the bridegroom's friend, became the herald of Messiah's name. Let us pray. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Godspeed.